I am so glad you convinced me that the family car should be the Defender 110. It is so beautiful inside, it's so comfortable, and it just feels indestructible.
Yes, it really is. I've been waiting a long time for the new model to come out. The Defender 110, I'm telling you, it's my favorite car of all times. It's my third one. You know, I have stories of going off road. The guy managed the group. He was like, "What are you doing in this beautiful car?" I'm like, "I'm going off road." He's like, "Are you sure? Because you can use one of ours." And then they look like Mad Max cars. I'm like, no, we're going to do this. And he was shocked.
Wow. Well, it's great because the Defender has been reimagined for 21st century adventure, and its unparalleled off-road ability as well as its robust interior are invaluable whether you're headed towards uncharted territory or just a weekend of exploration. The Defender 110 tackles challenging surroundings with absolute confidence. The SUV conveys strength outside and in, featuring peerless technology like an intuitive driver display and an award-winning infotainment system. That's my favorite part, to keep you connected no matter where the journey takes you. Adventure is unique to everyone, and so is the Defender. Choose from the two-door Defender 90, the four-door Defender 110, or the larger Defender 130 with the ability to seat up to 8 passengers. You'll find uncompromising performance in all three. So pack up and go even further with the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender.
These days, we're all investors, trying to be smart with our money despite our worst impulses. But at iShares, we believe that deep down inside of every investor is a better investor. One that's just waiting to be let out. Explore iShares ETFs and insights and let your best investor out. Visit iShares.com for more information.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show. Today on the James Altucher Show.
David Rubenstein is a man that wears many hats. First off, he's a multi-billionaire and an incredible philanthropist. He's donated to so many different organizations. It's hard to describe them all. But he's the head of the Carlyle Group, which is a private equity group that has like around $500 billion. I don't even know how much. But the subject of this podcast is his book, The American Experiment. He interviewed everybody from great historians to Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, to athletes like Billie Jean King, to former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, to documentarian Ken Burns, to historian Walter Isaacson. Every single chapter in this book, and there's chapters about the Civil War, chapters about Native American history, chapters about the presidential election of 2020. I learned something in every single chapter. And plus, we spend a lot of time talking about, given the lessons from history, what is going to happen in the future with all this money stimulus printing and COVID and the recent events in Afghanistan. Not only is David, of course, a historian, but he has so much influence on the financial system. It's really fascinating to hear his answers. So this is divided into parts 1 and part 2, both parts on the same day. Enjoy. David, when I read this book, almost every single chapter, I learned things that surprised me about American history and the American experience. And also, you're a great interviewer. You could tell you're not just trying to get information from the people you're interviewing. You're learning things as well. You're curious and you're learning things from your interviewees about American history, the American experience, and so on. What were some of the things that you surprisingly learned, that surprised you?
Well, I was surprised at the fact that so many people in our country have struggled so long to get certain rights that were promised in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And despite the fact that we've had these long struggles and stress tests that I've called, the most recent of which was, of course, the election and the pandemic, but the greatest of them was the Civil War, the country is still filled with people who are optimistic about the future. People are not leaving the country because they're disappointed in the country. In fact, people are generally pretty happy with the country, though they recognize that we have challenges. So the country is one which has suffered a lot in the last 230 years, but every country has suffered. People here are resilient. They've come back. They recognize we have flaws, but I think generally people feel that we're in the right direction and heading to a better place than we are right now.
Well, where do you think you talk about the suffering of Native Americans and, of course, the suffering caused by slavery, suffering in our various wars. Where do you see the suffering happening right now and room for improvement?
Well, today we have, I'd say, three problems that I think where there's a fair amount of suffering. And as we talk, one of my nemesis is coming. You may hear it. I've written in articles about things called leaf blowers. A leaf blower is some invention somebody has which apparently moves leaves from one part of a lawn to another. And for some reason, people have an obsession with moving leaves around. And apparently the muffler has not yet been invented for the leaf blower. So I have some leaf blower outside, and I think he's determined to make as much noise as possible. But anyway.
Well, why don't you invest in a muffler for leaf blowers?
That is something I've thought about. In fact, when I've complained about this before, I've gotten dozens of people sending me leaf blowers saying that their version is quieter than the ones I'm normally listening to. But I am amazed at how civilization's gone forward with several thousand years, and only recently have we noticed that we needed leaf blowers to make sure we're sure that civilization would progress further. But okay, in any event, you may hear a leaf blower who's no doubt trying to maximize the amount of noise he makes. In any event, to answer your question, right now, the biggest challenges that this country has are the dysfunction of the government and the distrust of the government by so many people. Number two, the income inequality and the lack of social mobility that is increasing. And three, the overall, I would say, inability of the country to deal with its debt and financial issues, which I think at some point are going to come back and give us very, very big problems. And we have enormous amounts of financial debt, as you know, in the country. So I think those are three of the problems that I think are particular to this country. Clearly, the global climate change issue is particular to every country, not just this country.
And so, it's interesting about the debt. Obviously increased huge during COVID and the various bailouts and stimulus programs. You're very much in tune with the financial situation through the Carlyle Group. And yet when I talk to others, whether it's members of the Federal Reserve or economists, there's also enormous deflationary pressures on the dollar. The demand for the dollar around the world, the efficiencies of technology, particularly the internet. Where do you see things going 3-4 steps ahead with what's been happening?
Well, currently we can afford the debt because interest rates are very low. When we return to a more normal interest rate environment, the debt of the United States government is going to be quite significant. And at some point, if we keep running $3.5 trillion annual deficits, we're just not going to be able to easily afford everything we want to do in our budget, including paying the interest. It's not a problem until it's a problem. As you know, all of a sudden, something that seems apparent to people today, nobody cares about it. And then all of a sudden, when people get nervous about it, and people will say, how could we have not known that? For example, take the debt we have today. Right now, people on Wall Street do not seem particularly worried about it. People in Washington are not worried about it. But at some point, I suspect when interest rates begin to go up again, people will start focusing on the fact that we're paying so much money in interest that we just can't keep doing this forever without cutting back on some of the spending we already have. So it is a challenge. In my view, I recognize that right now, everybody in Washington, everybody in New York is kind of focused on other things, but it is a big problem.
What's a worst case scenario and what's a best case scenario? Like, how do we get out of this okay?
There are 5 ways you can solve this debt problem. Number one, we can default on the debt and say, well, guess what? We didn't really mean this debt. We weren't going to pay it back. That's not a good solution. 2, you can inflate your way out of it. When I worked in the government under Jimmy Carter, we had high inflation. That's not a good solution, but that's one way you get out of a debt problem. A third way is we go to the IMF for a bailout, but the IMF can't afford to bail us out, so that's not a good solution. So you're really down to tax increases or spending cuts. Now, of course, economic growth can solve a lot of problems, but an economy of our size is not probably going to grow sustained basis for 5-6% a year. Maybe we can do it for a couple quarters or so, but generally, I think we're kind of going to be having around 2 to 3% growth. At that growth rate, you've either got to cut expenses or increase taxes. There's no other way around it. And right now, there's no interest in Washington in really making major spending cuts. And I don't think there's a great interest in tax increases, but there probably will be some coming along.
And this starts to segue into your book and American history and the American experiment. I don't know of any recent president that has been able to cut spending. Who do you think is the best president in the past 200 years that did successfully trim government or cut spending?
Well, nobody has been able to really say no to spending, but I would point out that while you would not associate him with being a spending cutter, perhaps, under President Clinton, we did balance the budget several times. Now, obviously, there was Graham-Rudman-Hollings, which put in a mechanism in to kind of keep the spending at a certain level. But unless you have some kind of mechanism and you keep up with that mechanism and maintain it, in the end, spending is going to be, somewhat out of control. And we're not willing to cut to raise taxes to a level that will deal with the spending we have. So I would think about it right now. Right now, in the last year's budget, we basically borrowed half the money we spent. That's not a prescription for economic success on the long term. You just can't keep borrowing forever.
And again, I want to get to your book, but how are you as a major investor, how are you positioning yourself for what could be happening in the future?
Well, I am worried about it. I can't tell you I have a brilliant solution. Of course, it's easy to say, well, when somebody wakes up and recognizes we have this problem, what are going to be the consequences? Well, lower GDP growth, which would mean the stock market probably will go down. The value of the dollar will probably go down. The value of other currencies obviously will go up. The value of gold and other kinds of hard commodities like that will probably go up. So if I were a macroeconomic trader, which I can't say that I am, I would say the things that one would do if you're worried about this would be to kind of take bets against the currency and bets in favor of hard commodities like gold, and also bet against the stock market. Now, I don't recommend people do that now because I'm not wise enough to figure out when this is going to occur. But at some point, I suspect you'll have some economic slowdown and some real concern about the debt and deficit much more than we have today.
Oh my gosh, I love these clothes. Mizzen and Main, that's Mizzen and Main. It really is the most comfortable work clothes. Travel clothes. I had to travel this whole week. I'm traveling for a week and a half, and I just took Mizzen and Main clothes with me. Close out 2023 in style with comfortable, breathable, packable, and machine washable pieces from Mizzen and Main. As you wrap up your year-end goals, enjoy a Mizzen and Main dress shirt that you can wear confidently. I like that they've very, very just nice, solid colors. I don't really like to get all fancy in patterns and everything, although they do have some pattern shirts, but very comfortable clothes, stretchable pants. It's just super comfortable, but they look professional, and you can wear them casually or professionally. I like some of their flannel shirts or untuck shirts. I love untuck. I never tuck in. So again, whether you're shopping for a special someone or giving yourself the gift you really want, I just buy myself gifts. Mizzen and Main is the perfect gift for any guy who works, travels, and cares about looking and feeling great. As you could tell by my many photos across the internet, I care about looking fantastic. I'm practically a model. And let's be honest, every guy loves to look great. So again, shop now at mizzenandmain.com and save 20% when you spend $130 or more using promo code James. That's promo code James at Mizzen and Main, Mizzen and Main.com. You know what I love about fantasy sports is that even though I'm not going to be a great basketball player or a baseball player or a football player or whatever, I feel like I get to participate and make decisions and use my knowledge of these different leagues or these different sports to compete. So it's like I can pick my team or I can pick my favorite players, and I could use my knowledge to make predictions and maybe even make money. So with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League on Prize Picks. This is a league created specifically for combo projections that include two or more players from different sports or leagues. Want to play alongside some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and comedian Andrew Schultz, who's also been a guest on this podcast, and I've been a guest on his? You can now find community plays under the promos tab of the app to view entries for some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each week. Look, Prize Picks even offers a reboot policy so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. For football and basketball games, if you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. Prize Picks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. What? So I love playing it. I love anywhere where I can use analytical ability with my interests to demonstrate some skill and maybe make some money. And I like the game-like aspect. I do wish they had chess as a category on prizepicks.com, but I'll settle for what they've got. Maybe I should make my own fantasy chess league. But in any case, I love Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/James. Use code James for a first deposit match up to $100. That's the easiest $100 you're ever going to make. So that's prizepicks.com/James and use code James. Daily fantasy sports made easy. The future of learning is definitely online. Like, it's such BS that you have to spend $200,000 or take $200,000 in loans and go to some fancy school when it's useless. It doesn't guarantee you a job. Most employers, including me, do not care about degrees or grades or anything like that. We want to care that you love what you're doing, that you know what you're doing, in some cases that you have experience or that you're willing to learn. But people in general love learning and are curious. Like, the key to success is curiosity. And I think masterclass.com is the perfect model for online learning. I'm really happy they're sponsoring this episode. If you're going to give a gift, give the gift of learning. Masterclass makes a meaningful gift this season for you and anyone on your list, because both of you can learn from the best to become your best, from leadership to effective communication to cooking. Let me tell you some of the classes I've taken. I've taken comedy from Steve Martin. I mean, can you believe I can take a class from Steve Martin on comedy, or Judd Apatow, my favorite comedy director? I could take an actual class from him on writing. Wolfgang Puck on cooking. Dan Brown on writing, or Judy Bloom, who's been on this podcast, on writing. By the way, Wolfgang Puck also has been on this podcast. It's such a pleasure. I try to take classes all the time from masterclass.com. And whether you're watching Masterclass on TV or listening in audio mode in the app or on their site, the quality speaks for itself. It's like these Masterclass instructors are your own personal mentors that are going to help you reach the next level. How much would it cost to take one-on-one classes on comedy from Steve Martin or on chess from Gary Kasparov? You just wouldn't be able to do it. But it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. With a Masterclass annual membership, it's $10 a month. Memberships start at $120 a year for unlimited access to one-on-one classes with all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. So it's not just $120 for one instructor. You get all 180 plus Masterclass instructors. Boost your confidence and find practical takeaways you can apply to your life and at work. And if you own a business or are a team leader, use Masterclass to empower and create future-ready employees and leaders. That's the real education in today's world. So this holiday season, you can give one annual membership and get one free at masterclass.com/JAS. JAS, of course, stands for the James Altucher Show. So right now you can get two memberships for the price of one at masterclass.com/JAS. Masterclass.com/JAS. Offer terms apply. Getting to the book. Every chapter gave me pause. There was things to think about. In your chapter about Frederick Douglass, Douglass called Lincoln one of the biggest slave catchers around. This was a surprise to me. And he also mentions that the Civil War did not initially start as a war against slavery, which is against everything I learned, of course, growing up.
Well, the Civil War was started in part because Abraham Lincoln was in favor of not extending slavery into new states, though he did not intend ever to end slavery in the existing states. And in fact, it's hard to believe this in hindsight, but there was something called the 13th Amendment, which was designed by James Buchanan, Lincoln's predecessor. And that 13th Amendment was designed to say slavery is part of the law of the land and will not be changed. In his inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln endorsed that. He endorsed the idea that slavery was part of the Constitution. His concern was extending it to new states, not existing states. So when Lincoln got elected, people didn't really believe him, or at least people in the South didn't believe him. He got very few votes at all in the South. People believed that he was going to not only stop the extension of slavery, but to get rid of it in the South where it had been protected by the Constitution. So states began to secede. Lincoln wanted to keep the country together, and so his effort was to kind of keep the country together. But in the end, as he pointed out in his Gettysburg Address, what the main purpose of his real effort was, in the end, was to end slavery. And he didn't propose ending it initially because he didn't think he had the right to do so. He ultimately issued the Emancipation Proclamation because he thought as a war measure, it would help him win the war if he freed the slaves, and they would then fight against the South, among other things. But in the end, he became known as the Great Liberator. But in fact, he had not gone into the Civil War trying to liberate the slaves. It ultimately turned out to be the only way he thought he could win the war.
I mean, Lincoln is held up almost in this mythological way as, again, the president that freed the slaves, and that it was his vision from the beginning, as you suggest he might have suggested. But what do you think truly made Lincoln the great president he was?
Well, Lincoln had many great features, and I think he was the greatest American of them all and the greatest president of them all. He wasn't a perfect person, for sure. He made jokes that today would be inappropriate. He was not really an abolitionist at all. He moved very slowly to get rid of slavery, and he only did it as a wartime measure, really. But the reason he's considered so great, and the reason I think he's so great, is one, he held the Union together. If you take the view that the United States is better off as a country united than divided, he ensured that it would have stayed united. I think many other people elected at the time Lincoln was elected, had they faced with the South seceding, would have said, okay, go your separate way and we'll go our way. Lincoln didn't do that, so he kept the country together. Two, he ultimately came by circuitous routes to ending slavery. So that was a plus. Three, he was martyred as a young age, and when you're assassinated, you tend to take on mythic kind of image, and I think basically that probably helped deify him a bit, unfortunately. So I think he will go down in history as the greatest president and greatest American because he kept the country together and he ended our greatest birth defect, which was slavery.
Now, when you say he kept the country together, earlier on in the chapter on the Declaration of Independence, you quote the Declaration of Independence and you say, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish the government and to institute a new government.
Yes.
And the South was basically saying at the time of the Civil War that they were ready to do that. So where's the line where a president should say, okay, go your way, or the president should say, no, we're staying as one government, as dictated by the Declaration of Independence? Okay,
they're two different things. In the Declaration of Independence, we didn't have a constitution that we had agreed to with England. Each state, each colony had its own charter, and we did have, through the rhetoric of Thomas Jefferson, the idea that when you aren't being treated appropriately, you have the right to break away. The Constitution was an organic document that all the states in the Union had agreed to, and it was different than what we did with England. But I obviously can see the point you're making, which is that the Americans broke away from the British. Why couldn't the Southerners break away from the Northerners? Well, under the Constitution, there was no provision to secede. Now, I guess you could argue they had the right to do it, but I think the country was better off being held together. Now,
Obviously, yes.
had the South succeeded in what it did, I suspect at some point the South would have reunited with the United States, with the northern states. But there aren't many people who take the view that the South might have affiliated with some foreign government. Maybe it would have affiliated with the French. Maybe it would have become part of some other country. You just don't know. But in the end, I think this country today is the strongest country politically, militarily, economically in the world, in part because we have all the states together in one union.
Right, and I agree. I was just curious on your answer to that. In your introduction, it's really great how you break apart the 13 what you call genes of the American DNA. Things like democracy, capitalism, freedom of speech. I want to talk about some of these things in relationship to some of your interviews. You interview former Washington Post publisher Donald Graham about freedom of speech. And this has become a big issue in the past year, particularly since so much communication has happened over social media. And companies like Twitter and Facebook argue that freedom of speech doesn't apply to them because they're private corporations. Again, where's the line where freedom of speech does apply and doesn't apply, and where should it be?
Well, of course, that's a complicated question, but the First Amendment to our Constitution says the government shall not abridge speech. It doesn't say that private corporations can't abridge free speech. So clearly, a private company can do what it wants within reason of not breaking other laws. It's different than when the government tries to prohibit speech.
Right, but when a private company takes on some of the features of being part of the government, it's kind of a hazy area. So Jack Dorsey himself, the CEO of Twitter, has said that Twitter is a form of a public square, almost like a government-run area. Does social media have too much control over our speech?
Well, there's no doubt that the social media vehicles like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or other kinds of devices like that have become so important in our society, they're almost like a government utility or a utility sanctioned by government. The reason that the Pentagon Papers case came out the way it did was it went to the Supreme Court. In the end, if President Trump's being prohibited from going on Twitter or Facebook were to go to the Supreme Court, you might get some resolution that would be more than just Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg saying they shouldn't go on their vehicles. But for the time being, it is a tricky area. I think it's going to have to ultimately be litigated, and I don't know how it will come out. But for sure, it is different when the government prohibits something from being said than where a company prohibits it. But your point is, which is well taken, then you become as powerful as Twitter or Facebook. You're in effect a semi-government, and therefore you're acting like a government in many ways, but you are acting like a private vehicle when you want to be acting like a private vehicle.
And again, I asked the question not really in reference to President Trump, but just, there were many things, discussions about COVID or discussions about war. There were a lot of things that it seemed arbitrary what was allowed and what wasn't. And, since that was when everyone was working remote, that was the main way people communicated. So it's an interesting question.
Look, there's no doubt that the antitrust laws probably weren't set up for things like Facebook or Twitter, where you're not really paying something. You're getting a service for free, you could argue, and it's not the same as you're buying something and there's some anti-competitive price that you're paying. But I don't know that our antitrust laws were set up to kind of deal with these kind of situations, and maybe they'll have to be adjusted at some point. But for currently, I think it's fair to say that these private companies have a disproportionate amount of influence. When you think about it, you've got 5 or 6 companies which are quite successful companies and have a lot of influence in our lives. Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Netflix, Google, Amazon. Think how powerful these companies are, and think about what you do every day in your own daily life or my own daily life. If you couldn't exercise the right to buy or use any of the services any of these companies that I just mentioned provided, what would you do? How would your life be able to be normal or functioning?
The flip side of this is, and you talk about this in the chapter on capitalism. One of the 13 genes of the American DNA is capitalism and entrepreneurship. But at the same time, you talk about the role of Theodore Roosevelt in regulating capitalism. Where, again, is the line between how much regulation of capitalism, where it helps capitalism or it doesn't help?
There's no easy answer, but right now in the United States, you obviously have a lot of entrepreneurs who believe they can start a company, grow it, become wealthy, and create a great service. So I don't think the government is overly regulating right now entrepreneurial activity. However, if you were to go to China today and try to start a new company today, it might be more complicated than it was a year or two ago, because China is now worried about the impact of some of these large technology companies. In effect, right now, we are in a race with China to figure out whose technology is going to dominate the world in the next 10, 20, 30 years. For most of the last 10 years, American technology has really dominated the world. So the companies I just mentioned earlier, they are used around the world, everywhere in the world. I mean, not China, but Facebook and Google and other kinds of American technologies are used everywhere. Now China would like to have its technologies expand beyond China. So Tencent, Baidu, Ant Financial, Alibaba, TikTok, among others, are going to try to export that technology. And we're in a race with China to kind of figure out whose technology is going to be the dominant one in the world. And that's going to be one of the great fights of the next 10, 15, 20 years.
I see one of the problems we have, or one of the good things on China's side, is that they don't really have, let's call it, moral boundaries about their use of technology. So you have a chapter on genomics, for instance. This is maybe one of the greatest innovations that are going to affect the world in the next 20 years, and disease and so on. We have various ethical boundaries around our use of genomics. China seems not to. Could this drastically increase their possibility of winning this race over the next few decades?
Well, China has some boundaries as well. As you may know, someone did something with CRISPR technology with a baby in China, and that person was sanctioned, I think, house arrest or in prison. But there's no doubt that China is probably, in my view at least, willing to develop technologies in ways that we probably are not going to be able to legally do in the United States, because China sees itself as in a different mission than maybe we do. I think China has much more influence in the companies that it has created than the United States government has in the companies that have been developed here. I think in the next 10, 20, 30 years, the great race is going to be between the United States and China for economic and technological dominance. And that's going to be much greater than the fight we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
Right. And so again, what do you see the outcome of that when we are so nervous around so many different issues involving technology? And you're right, the Chinese government is involved in their companies, but mostly they push them beyond these ethical qualms that seem to hold us back.
Well, look, the thing about this, for about a century and a half, Britain dominated the world. It's a tiny country in the North Sea of the globe, not exactly the central spot of the globe. Yet because they had better technology, a smaller population, that didn't matter. They were able to rule India with 20,000 soldiers at one point. Obviously, India is a gigantic country. 20,000 soldiers, all the British had there. So now that everybody has access to technology, I think population is going to mean much more. So we've been ruling the world for about 100 years. We've had better technology and other kinds of advantages. I think over the next 100 years, it's unlikely that we'll have the same dominance, because China's got a population 3 times our size, and therefore they just have much more. They will have much more economic clout, and they'll have a lot of technology that we probably won't be able to match as readily or as quickly in some cases.
And what could be the effect on America from that?
Well, the United States has been the largest economy in the world since 1870. I think probably in your lifetime and probably in my lifetime, China will become the biggest economy in the world. which they would say is their rightful position, because for much of organized history, China was the biggest economy in the world. So up until probably the 1700s, they were the biggest economy. They would just say they're regaining their rightful position as the biggest economy. The impact on the United States will be this. When you grew up and your parents grew up, the United States had a dominant economic position in the world. Today, that's receding a bit, and therefore the lifestyles of people in the United States won't be, for everybody, quite as good as it was before. I would say the per capita growth, the per capita income probably won't grow at the same rate that it did many years ago. And in the end, China will be a bigger economy and with greater wealth. They probably won't pass our per capita income for any time soon, but in the end, we have much more competition than we'd had after World War II. After World War II, we were more than half the world's GDP. Now we're about 18%.
So that was part one. The conversation continues in part two. More predictions about the future of America, given COVID and so on. We talk about how do we have heroes from American history, given what we know now are the really bad things many people did. And David explains why he did not invest in Amazon.
AI might be the most important new computer technology ever. It's storming every industry and literally billions of dollars are being invested. So buckle up. The problem is that AI needs a lot of speed and processing power, so how do you compete without costs spiraling out of control? It's time to upgrade to the next generation of the cloud, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI. OCI is a single platform for your infrastructure, database, application development, and AI needs. OCI has 4 to 8 times the bandwidth of other clouds, offers one consistent price instead of variable regional pricing, and of course, nobody does data better than Oracle. So now you can train your AI models at twice the speed and less than half the cost of other clouds. If you want to do more and spend less, like Uber, 8x8, and Databricks Mosaic, take a free test drive of OCI at oracle.com/advance. That's oracle.com/advance. oracle.com/advance.